recording, so I assume it's the first time. It's the first time I'm recording on Zoom. So, well, my name is Fede Apesena. I'm one of the pastors of the many pastors that the North Georgia Conference has. I'm myself an immigrant, and I'm part of a task force for undocumented people that it's a group within the North Georgia Conference that works in ways to create awareness to our church members and the community about this social issue that is happening, and to bring a little bit of light towards the life of those that we call undocumented, as what people call illegal immigrants. We just try to put a face to a status that we are giving to people. And so one of the greatest encouragements for this group and the initiatives came from the person that I'm having a conversation now, Bishop Sue. If you want to introduce yourself, like I said before I started recording, everybody probably knows who you are. But if you want to share a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, no, my name is Sue Haupert-Johnson, and I am almost 4 years in my first term as the resident bishop of the North Georgia Annual Conference. And it's been great. I've had a wonderful time just traveling all over the annual conference, meeting all sorts of folks from all sorts of backgrounds. And it just emphasized to me every day how contextual ministry is, how to presume, you know how to do ministry to one group of people may not be accurate or in one place to another. And I think we learned that as part of the itinerancy. You think you have your toolkit in place and then you move and it doesn't work anymore. So I think the benefit of the oversight I have loved. I have seen and met so many people. It was funny. I get letters sometimes that say, you really don't know the North Georgia Conference. And I think, no, you really don't. I've been in every corner of it. I've met all sorts of laity and clergy, all sorts of regions, wealthy, impoverished, immigrant, not illegal. And I don't even like the term illegal, but you meet everybody and you see the need across the board. And so I have seen how much ministry needs to be done in North Georgia. I've seen where the church is rising to the challenge, and I've seen where the church is really happy to maintain the status quo and turn a deaf ear to a lot of the need in North Georgia. And so that's, part of the challenge you and I share is how do we help people live out their faith in ways that are result in justice, that result in opportunity, that give voice and respect to all of God's children. How do we do that? And how do we make the church a community of faith that desires to do that and understands that as a part of its identity, which is a challenge?
Thank you. And so, going a little bit more specific about all the things that you experience, can you share a little bit about why is this issue of undocumented people a special interest to you as a bishop?
Right. Well, I grew up in Florida, and it's interesting. I don't think there's anything as happenstance in life. I think God exposes you to stuff. And I remember as a child, my father loved nothing better than fresh produce. And so he would drag us along to wherever it was freshest. And one of the great places in Florida is a little town called Ruskin. And Ruskin tomatoes were the finest in the world. I mean, that was their industry. They were known for that. And I still remember the first day we went to the fields to the little stand to buy tomatoes. And I was with my dad. I was probably 7, 8 years old. And there were little shacks along the road. And I thought that's where they stored the tomatoes. I said, Dad, is that where they stored the tomatoes? He said, no, that's where the migrants live. That's where the folks who come and pick the fields live. And so then we went back another time, and there were little children. There were children younger than I out in the fields with their parents. And they had no running water. They had an outhouse. I had never seen some of the living conditions that they lived in. And so that really impacted me. And expose me to the ugly underside of, and the owners who make so much money off the backs of these folks. I mean, somebody in this whole scheme is making a lot of money. I think the U.S., we could probably sit down in 3 or 4 days and come up with the sane and logical immigration process and policy, but that would require that these owners insure their workers, give them safe and healthy living conditions, and that just isn't the case. So, somebody's getting rich off this whole scheme, and somebody's fighting and lobbying against it, because there certainly is not the political desire to make this happen. And then after that, I served in Southwest Florida, near Immokalee, and the Immokalee farm workers have finally organized, but I saw horrific stories of young girls molested in the fields and used as sex objects. The working conditions still poor. The deportation threat after Hurricane Charlie went through. There were out on Pine Island near Cape Coral, there were trailer parks that were mostly occupied by migrant farm workers, and they were destroyed. And I remember going out with my husband and our plant manager, who was Dominican, and we ran off all we could of Spanish assurances from the government that they could come and receive aid at the local churches and not be deported, because they had nothing. They would have starved. And so it just showed me numerous times in my ministry, I've seen just the desperation and the deprivation and the inequality. I mean, once again, a lot of money is made off the backs of these folks. And then in Ocala, where we served also, Ocala is home to some of the lushest and most beautiful horse farms in the world. A lot of them are staffed by immigrants. And I remember vividly the day 2 FBI agents showed up in my office because the sex trade in that area is really bad. I mean, they have women brought in from other countries and sold for sex. And, these vast horse farms, it's hard to police. And so once again, I saw just taking advantage of human beings. And that is not what Christ would have us do. And that is not. And then to see this politicized, and to see people talk as if there are animals. When people seeking asylum were coming to the United States, and they were given words like infestation. Those are words you use for insects and vermin, not human beings. And so I grow weary of the inhumane treatment, the trivialization, and the just dehumanization of a whole group of people that continues. Recently watched the documentary Unafraid about the DACA young people here in North Georgia who have worked hard their whole lives and have tremendous, tremendous hurdles they have to overcome that just aren't fair. And so, to me, it's a false understanding of the Christian faith. The Christian faith, I think Christ calls us to allow every human being to live into their full giftedness. And I guess the last comment I'll make is now, before COVID, I travel a lot. And when you live in hotels, you get to know the folks who work in hotels. And a lot of them are undocumented. A lot of them are mostly women who are doing backbreaking labor for no money. And I look at them and I befriend them and I think, boy, I bet some of them have some real, are incredibly intelligent and have gifts that are so needed by the human race today and by our country that could benefit from that. But they are trapped. There's no way, especially if they have children and have no way to have childcare, they are trapped, cleaning motel rooms for the rest of their lives with no disability. I worked in the federal courts. I know if you're undocumented and you get hurt, there's nothing for you. And so I think that we're going to be accountable. The United States is going to be held accountable for how we have mistreated folks, how we have failed to see their giftedness. I mean, I think we've made a mockery of the Statue of Liberty, which, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And coming from a family of immigrants, one part of my family immigrated in the mid-1600s, so they were early on the scene, but I had another part of my family that were Moravian missionaries from Germany that came in the 1800s. So we're all products of immigrants, and I think that the United States has benefited tremendously from the gifts of my family, and we're indebted to the United States for that. And I think that's how it should be. The United States has always been a place that was fertile ground for immigrants, and didn't always treat them well, but they're remarkably, my forebears and your forebears, remarkably resilient people, and they worked hard, and they just wanted to see some benefit from their labor. So that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
Yeah, so a couple of comments referring to things that you just shared, because you were saying that you saw a lot of these things, growing up. But I lived in North Carolina for 5 years and worked with farm workers in a lot of migrant communities, and there are a lot of minors that are working the field. There are surprisingly laws or loopholes that allow for farmers to have minors working now today.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And regarding the talented, here in Georgia, we have one of the few in the US or in the world universities underground for undocumented students, Freedom University. And several of us in the task force and working with migrants, we had a chance to meet a lot of them, and they crushed it through elementary school, through high school, getting the top of their class. It's like constantly a friend that came to give a talk. She married to a U.S. citizen. Now she's a U.S. citizen, but she was saying that she will live with a chip on her shoulder of always having to overachieve because she was undocumented. She has to prove over and over again that she deserves to be here, and that's a hard burden to carry.
Well, and now some of the proposed executive orders just make that policy. We will not let you into the U.S. unless you are, you have independent wealth. You're brilliant. It just is. It's.
If I have independent wealth, I come here on vacation. I don't have to come here to work. Exactly.
Right. So it just is disturbing.
So let me ask you. Should this issue, I believe in general, so I believe you do believe this, therefore we have a task force within the conference, but should advocating or how should we see this matter as a priority for the church? How should we?
Right. Well, I think where it devolves is when it is made into issues of all or nothing. There's no rational discussion. They're flash tests. You either believe that the U.S. should be, one side is no borders at all. Everybody, it's a free for all. Come on in, and we don't care what you've done with your life or who you are. We'll let you in. That's how one side is painted, and then the other side is, if you have a ridiculous amount of money to pay for the privilege. If you have the family bloodline, if you're from a country that we prefer, right, that's even been stated. And that just, I think, is a non-starter. We need to have folks in the room who are willing to say, there does need to be a policy. There does need to be a way that we preserve our borders, but there needs to be a way where if you have the drive and the desire and the yearning, and let's face it, there are a lot of jobs in the United States that Americans don't want to do. I mean, I talk to owners all the time, construction folks. They are dependent on folks who are not documented to do roofing, I mean, there's just a lot of jobs that it's very hard to find folks to do. And so let's have some discussion. Let's have some, let's come to a policy that does preserve our borders, that does have integrity, but that also allows for opportunity and for, if you have the desire and you have some skills and talent that we desperately need folks to pick the crops when they're done. That's a huge issue with the food chain. If all of the migrant workers, farm workers get COVID, we're in trouble. And so why can't we have a system that allows people to have health care, to have, to be insured against injury, to really, yes, you'll have to pay them a little more. Yes, it'll cost the owners of the farms a little more. But isn't that just basic, basic human justice, basic need? And the reality is they get taken to our emergency rooms anyhow, and we pay for it anyhow systemically. So how do we do it in a logical, reasonable, and tempered way that doesn't just move into talking points on the extreme ends of the argument? So I hope our task force can engage folks, but also I hope that our legislators are willing to have the discussion, because a lot of times, and I've been to Washington to lobby, and a lot of times you just get the pat on the head and the nod, and there's just really not a need to engage, and that disturbs me. So I think we need to elect folks who are willing to have the discussion, to deal with the problems head on, to not just spew party rhetoric, whichever side, whichever party they're part of, but to really be part of the solution rather than this ongoing systemic problem.
But you just said it. Having the conversation, I think that's a key thing. I think for a lot of people. So right now, I'm finishing my appointment at the Net Church, and we have the opportunity to bring some DACA students and others that were not able to be DACA because they didn't make it into the time frame, and they were able to share their story with our, two of our campuses here, and we have conservative people, politically speaking. Some of them at the beginning got offended because they see these opportunities as political, but mostly just trying to put a face. I think it was more the shock of putting a face into a phrase or a status. And I'm not saying people just change their view regarding immigration, but at least that, just seeing that face and being able to have that conversation after worship, because it was during worship that we gave that opportunity, allow people to just at least ask the questions, is my harsh? It's humane, because even though you're feeling humane, but when you are not interacting with people that follow, they fall into that box, you're unable to see people's faces. So, and I think so. This good segue for my next question. Probably is a couple of questions in one, because one of the things, a lot of churches now have the guidelines in good ways, because I think arguing through social media is the worst. About posting about political issues, but when it's talk about social issues, people see it a lot as political, and a lot of ways. So how should the church talk about it? And also, like I asked you behind the scenes, for pastors that we're moving into new appointments, we spend years learning how to communicate these issues with the congregations that we're working with. How do we bring this into our new appointments? How should we interact, learn from the view of our new appointment that we are heading towards?
Yeah, I think it takes great intentionality. And I think you referred earlier, the issue, I think you can't ever have an issue just be an issue. It has to be human. I think that a lot of the evils of our world today are done by just dehumanizing and making something an issue. So I can talk about, these horrible immigrants who are dangerous and, murderous, and who are just out to take what they can get. And, that's the stereotype. And the only way I can combat that stereotype is to bring somebody for you to have a relationship with, because that stereotype is not accurate. It's dehumanizing. And if you look at all of the, I don't know, I think I could do graduate study and just write volumes on how, if you want to encourage exclusion, if you want to encourage genocide, if you want to encourage the total annihilation of a group or a race, you dehumanize them. And so I think any pastor has to make this a human issue. So when you bring the DACA folks in and you see their integrity, you see their work ethic, you see their love for this country, you can't paint all migrants or immigrants or undocumented folks with a broad brush. And so I think that that's the way to go at it, and to come at it with both and. I mean, I know on social media you say one thing and you're painted on one political party or another, and that gets ugly. But I think if you can come in, I recently, I finally just quit posting anything that could be mischaracterized on social media. And boy, there were some trolls who just went after me. I had said something about justice. I think it was and I still think that when Donald Trump called some countries, shithole countries, that's racist. Okay, that, when you say, I want to let all Norwegians into the country, but nobody from these African countries, or that's racist. Let's just name it. And I had some people, how dare you criticize the president? How dare you? I mean, they just teed off. And God bless a good friend of mine from South Florida, and he is as conservative can be. And he wrote, I wish you guys would quit bashing the bishop on this. I think I'm very conservative. I think she and I could sit down at dinner and hash out these problems in a couple of hours. And that's the helpful thing, that that each party has points that need to be emphasized. I mean, I think we do have to face fiscal reality, and we do have to make sure that, people who are born here have opportunities equal to those who aren't. Yeah. I get it, but I do think that it has to be a dialogue. And so for a pastor to go in, and you have the soapbox, you've got the pulpit, and you have to be very judicious in how you use it. That means you don't ignore it, but you realize that an awful lot of education has to take place. So, like in matters of race, I wouldn't go into a pulpit and just pound people with white privilege and all that, but I could have a group of people read with me Waking Up White or White Fragility, and help them to educate. There's a great, I took the cabinet and some other leaders to the annual conference, and there was a board game you play where some of you are privileged, mostly white, and some of you take the role of those who aren't. And there's an education part of the game where you see all the policies that have privileged white people through decades in the United States. And so in a way that isn't in your face or threatening, you're learning that this is not an even playing field. And that even if I am very nice to all the undocumented or migrant folks that I know, I am part of a systemic sin. I am part of systemic ways where they have been taken advantage of and misused by the policies of this country. And so I would say I think it is every pastor's obligation to preach about justice. I mean, Jesus was crucified because he went after those who thought they had all the answers and those who were oppressing. Years ago, we preached on the 10 Commandments, and people came the week "Thou shalt not steal" and thought we would, talk about people stealing TVs and refrigerators and how horrible they are. But when you look at that, no, that commandment is really directed at folks who are wealthy, who are taking advantage of the poor. They're using unlawful weights and measures. There's all sorts of that. So I think that it's incumbent upon a pastor to preach about matters of justice and matters of equality. But you got to, Jesus said, you got to be wise as a serpent and innocent as a dove. You can't just go in and start bashing. You've got to go in and develop relationship and develop trust, and then introduce folks who trust you to folks who need justice, and make it human and make it real and help folks. And I do think most people, especially those who are part of the church, have a good heart. I hope. I think there are in every congregation folks who want to be faithful. But I look at our history in the South. I mean, all of our churches, all of the major Methodist churches in Georgia had a long catalog of why slavery was okay, why women's suffrage was a threat. So, and we got a long history of wanting to hold the status quo, and Martin Luther King spoke eloquently about this. But the church, when it gets compromised with the culture and entrenched, then sometimes there's less action in the church, and that's why often the secular world moves into the future better than the church. I mean, you look at the military. I mean, the military has long had more egalitarian understandings of service than the church. So my word would be, do it well, be a prophet, be a person for justice, but at the same time, don't do it in a stupid manner. You've got to know your people. You've got to build the trust. You've got to have a relationship, and that's what gives you credibility and the trust to speak into their lives in a different way. And I think, does that helpful?
Definitely. We had a moment last year. So a couple of pastors we were supporting because, in Georgia is one of 3 states that undocumented students cannot access to public higher education.
Right.
So there was a protest in the War of Regents, and I was there with a couple of pastors and community leaders, and we all end up in jail. And so I'm thankful that I was working with Reverend Rodrigo Cruz. He's a respected leader here in the community. And so after I got out the next day, so we talk on the phone, and he's like, "I'm in keeping your job mode right now. We'll talk in a minute." And a week after that, we had like some sort of town hall meeting within the church, because several people were questioning, well, we cannot have a leader in the church that went to jail, which raised a lot of questions, regarding the history of Christianity. Most of our leaders, if not all, were in prison at some point or killed. But it did create the interesting opportunity of a conversation, which just opened the floor. We had, I think, around 80 people. And we had people that were against the process, in favor, and some that have no idea. And if we learned something, is that with good guidance, it was a fruitful and beautiful conversation, which allowed us to bring documented students to speak from the pulpit in our church. It wasn't like a shock, here.
Right. Yeah.
To you. It was a prior process of Austin's conversations of Pastor Rodrigo and me with people in the congregation, but I did learn, again, so people that probably I crossed path before that, and they sound really harsh about the subject. When the opportunity was given to have a conversation, you can see that their heart was in the right place. Sometimes this is a country it's difficult to separate your political views from your Christian views.
Yeah. And some are cast that way already. And I do think many times I have to remember that John Wesley saw sanctification as a process.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, it's a process that seems to move incredibly slowly. And then the Holy Spirit somehow one day, like at that moment in your church, will break it open and progress will be made and people are forever changed. But, I do think, I don't underestimate, though, there is evil out there in that, and I would recommend everybody watched Unafraid, the film about the DACA young people in North Georgia. And there's a scene in that when they're lobbying one of the legislative committees down at the State House. They're lobbying to allow the DACA people to have in-state tuition. I mean, they've paid taxes their whole lives, their parents have, and they are charged really extortionate tuition, high tuition. And they aren't allowed to go to some of the schools. They aren't allowed to go to UGA. They aren't allowed to go to some of the really fine schools in Georgia. And so they were lobbying, and they had a bill that they wanted to put through the legislature. And these kids poured their heart out. I mean, they made such a compelling argument. And the legislator, an older white man, looked at them and looked at the members of the committee and said, this isn't worth the paper it's written on. I just recommend tearing it up and throwing it away. And then he said, you think we don't know you, but we do know you. We know who you are. We know where you live. And it was just the most condescending. And I thought, I've seen the face of evil. I've seen, that there is smugness. And I've seen it so many times with legislators and with folks who think they have all the answers, and the smugness and the failure to hear and just lack of basic human decency. And that's out there. So I don't take for granted that there are powers and principalities out there that only the Holy Spirit can conquer. That's why I'm part of the church. I mean, I was a lawyer, and the law can take you so far, but at some point you have to have a power that changes the human heart and transforms and moves it on to perfection and love. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about perfection and love. And there's no better way to love another human being than to make sure that they're treated fairly, that they receive adequate medical care, that they live in decent conditions, that they eat well, that they aren't subjected to sex trade and to abusive situations. And that's at the heart of the Christian faith. So I'll take anybody on that. But at the same time, I realize it can't be a free-for-all. We can't have, everybody in the world coming to the United States at the same time, which makes it incumbent on us also to work for justice in other countries. I mean, part of my frustration is when you're talking about asylum seekers, they don't especially want to live in the United States. I mean, folks from El Salvador really, really love living in El Salvador. Mm-hmm. But there's only so many times you'll allow your daughters to be raped and your men to be killed before you have to seek a different reality. And so let's just own that too. I think the U.S. has to be a force, and the church has to be a force throughout the world to cry out for folks who have no voice in the face of horrible oppression and horrible persecution. So we can't ignore that aspect of it either. Anytime you talk about immigration, that's a big part of it, when asylum is needed and when folks have no hope. And we write off economic, well, they just need, well, yeah. I mean, let's face it, if my kid's starving, I'm going to try to go to a place where I can provide for them. And let's just have some basic compassion about that. So.
Well, and there is a lot of history about, why these countries are where they are and the role that the U.S. played in those countries. But that's a conversation for another.
Absolutely. Let's own, if I think part of, and this is another thing I can't stand, this kind of Pollyannish, the U.S.
I keep telling people, like, the dirty war, 30 years ago, and 20,000 disappearing. It was a plan elaborated by the U.S. that was fighting communism and South America, but they put every country in it. And we
Right.
lost 30,000 lives. 20 of those were under 20 years old.
Well, and let's name it. Only now am I fully aware of how lacking my education was. I mean, I didn't learn the history of South America. I didn't learn the history of Central America. I learned about white European countries. That was my education. And so part of it is to realize we are an uneducated group when it comes to places that we don't know much about and policies of the United States that we don't know much about. I mean, I think part of being a patriot is acknowledging where our country's messed up and how do we avoid that and how do we own the consequences of the actions of our country. And that, boy, that's not a very popular thing these days, but I think we have a lot of a lack of education and a lack of biblical education, a lack of biblical literacy, because I do not know how you can read Isaiah and Jeremiah and the prophets crying out for equality, crying out for justice for the poor, and not see that as an integral part of the church's role in the world. So.
Wow. Well, I think we can keep talking for hours, but I think that
we could.
That's the perfect ending for this. And well, Bishop, I want to thank you so much. We should do this more often.
Yeah, no, that it would help. And I hope churches will do this. You know, it's not. And I can say too, part of it is using, and we have folks who can help set the conversation up so it's constructive. Because we know it can devolve. We see it devolve all the time. But you can have rational, even-keeled, respectful conversation. You can disagree. But I think if you go into a conversation with let's see where our common ground is and agree what can happen, then we could get a long way. So use those tools. We have folks who can help set up those conversations.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Bishop. And
it's a pleasure.
Your words.
Thanks for
all right.
Appreciate it. Talk to you later on. Bye-bye.
Bye.